So let's start out today by taking a look at the next round of frequently made mistakes from the submissions I've seen so far. Everybody who has submitted their code and their Google submission form up to this point, I have reviewed. If you haven't done it, please make sure you take into account what I'm about to talk about. So first of all, this is the wrong way to initialize the M0 constant. And please go back and watch the video we did a week or so ago, which shows exactly how to do that. It's really straightforward. This is inefficient, and the reason why it's inefficient is because we're spawning or using a thread to set the value to 0, and there's a much more optimized way to do that that has no runtime overhead. It sets it up when the variable is initialized, when the field is initialized. This is a minor point, but just please try to get in the habit of chaining these things together. It's just a bit more functional and reactive and so on. So say crawl page async, parameters, close paren dot join. So that's the way to do that. Let's take a look here. There's no need to actually call filter objects non-null, and that's because get page async is actually giving back a completable future, not a value or an object. So it's not likely to be null unless really, really weird things have happened, like you've run out of memory, which will throw an exception. So you don't need to make that check. Down here, you don't want to call page future then compose. I think I might have talked about this last time we went through this stuff. You don't need to have that here. You can just call images on page and page links async and pass in the appropriate information here. So it's a little cleaner, a little more concise, more efficient. Here's images on page and page links async. Something important is missing here, which will end up causing your test to fail. So go back if you're still perplexed as to what has to go there. Go back and take a look at the sequential loops crawler, and you'll see what's going on in those types of cases. Something special you have to do. The depth. Down here, get page async. Again, there's no need to pass fork join pool common pool as the second parameter to supply async, because that factor method does that by default if you leave off this second parameter. So no need to be using built-in suspenders to get the common fork join pool. Bunch of people had some weirdness here, possibly because we didn't have the tests put together properly, which is now fixed. But a couple things. This is too complicated. There's a method. It actually should say to a method reference defined in, let's go ahead and take it from here, defined in image crawler Java that gets a stream of all the image source URLs in this document. So that will appear a couple places. So that's what you need to pass in here. Also, this is even more incorrect. Don't be calling crawl hyperlinks on page here. Instead, you want to go look and find a helper method defined in imagecrawler.java that gets a stream of all the image source URLs in this document. That's what needs to go in there as a method reference. And again, please, please, please start getting in the habit of using method references instead of Lambda expressions. We don't have an easy way to check for this with the unit test. We could actually check for it with ChatGPT, but we can't easily check for it with the unit test. So just remember that. Your IDE will tell you to do that. So it'll remind you if you need help or a hint, it'll actually do it for you automatically. Similar thing down here. Please refactor all this code so it just has a single call to a helper method. As usual, or as my style, I try very hard to make the code be carefully refactored so there's not a lot of duplication of the same boilerplate logic. This is what's often known as the don't repeat yourself principle or the dry principle, so I try to apply that. So when you find yourself writing kind of ugly code like this, it's probably a tip. You should think to yourself, gosh, that's awkward. Probably don't need to do it that way. There's probably a helper method somewhere that will save you some time and effort. All right, let's look at images on page async, some other issues here. So this should not be using then compose here. Instead, you want to use then apply async, passing in the appropriate method reference, followed by then compose async, passing in the appropriate method reference. So all of this stuff here is way too much effort. And again, think to yourself, what would Doug Schmidt do to refactor this so it would be clean and easy to find and understand? So again, try not to repeat stuff. If you see yourself repeating the same code multiple places, something's probably gone awry and you should refactor it or use the code in a way that will leverage the refactored code. Don't use then compose, use then compose async, because it'll run it concurrently. Down here, we talked about some examples of things to put here, and this is basically a method reference that does what the specification comment says, and it says it sums the results. So that gives you a hint as to what should go in there. Down here, there's no need to call map web page element get URL. There's no need to call filter objects non-null. And don't pass +1 here. It needs to go elsewhere in a different method. There's this call here, which I think should be caught by the unit tests now. If it's not, it should be, and let me know if it's not being caught. But don't use then apply async to sum the results. There's no need to do that. When you're summing two values together, or even n values together, no sense in giving that to a background thread to run. It's way more overhead than you actually need to have. So think about how you want to use threads when they're long-running computations that could block, but for short-lived things, you're better off typically doing it synchronously. Not always, but as a good rule of thumb. OK, this is too complicated. No need to do all of this kind of stuff with success not equal 0, question mark, 1, 0. There's cleaner, easier ways to do all this stuff. And you need to replace it with a simple method reference to a helper method that will handle these kinds of things. And also, no need to do all of this stuff, because you can simply use the collector, just like was done earlier in the crawl hyperlinks on page method. So that'll clean up a lot of the code. In fact, you'll notice that a couple of the methods have a very similar style of using collect with the appropriate collector, and then you use then apply to sum stuff together. So it's really clean and nice. Down here, transform image async. No need to do this check, and you don't need to call the map call here. If you do it right, it's nice and clean and short. And then finally, for transform image, this code is too complicated. You need to do something very much along the same lines of what you did in assignment B. I think there's a slight little difference or a slight little tweak, but you do something similar to that. And there's also no need to do this either. So whoops, that. So no need to do those things. So that's what I've seen so far. I think maybe a quarter of people have submitted their code for review. I've reviewed all the code, so all my comments should be pushed. If you haven't submitted your code, if you haven't pushed it to GitHub and you haven't submitted the Google submission form, make sure you go through this stuff and look carefully to make sure that your solution is working, at least not having these bugs. If there's other bugs, we'll address them, and other issues. Also, feel free to reach out through Piazza. I'm happy to take a look at your code if you're running into sticking points. Also, make sure you update the skeletons, especially the unit test part, because we've added tests for one of the methods that wasn't being tested before.